So one of the things that is important to talk about here whenever we're looking at the motion between voices is, number one, what's really the goal of identifying these types of motions? What's the goal of putting music in this four-part texture? And along with that, of course, what are the problems that we can run into? So we're sort of looking at the goals and the problems of voice leading, of part writing, or working in this four-part texture. So goal number one, and this goes back to sort of what we were just talking about with only using parallel motion. Goal number one of part writing is to have independence in the voices that we're using. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with a bunch of parallel harmony. But if this is the melody and the harmony part is doing that, it's not independent at all. It's completely reliant on the motion, the direction, the rhythm, everything of that first line of the main melody. And so when we're talking about building something up to four parts or building something up to a larger musical texture, we can sort of quickly see that you don't want everyone doing just the same thing, right? It may be great for instance, for the two singers or a singer and a horn player or something to be working in parallel harmony. But you don't want, for instance, the bass player to also just be doing what they're doing. And you don't want the drummer, for instance, to be only playing the rhythm that the melodies do, right? It sort of breaks down really quickly when you look at this in a big picture. So we really want to make sure that our various lines have an independent musical goal, have their own musical purposes that, of course, fit the whole. But that's really one of the main things that we are looking for here. The other goal that's, again, makes sense in this four-part context, but also is a larger musical goal, is to write smooth and singable lines, right? So we don't want to have something that's independent just for the sake of being independent. We also want it to be smooth. We also want it to make musical expressive sense and to be fairly singable. And this goes back to that important point where we're not worried about sort of making a finished product musically deep thing right now. We're worried about creating a musical texture that works and that we can build on. So when we talk about smooth and singable, that does mean that we're not going to be looking at super complicated things, because now's not the time for that. We're not worried about the complicated stuff right now. We want to make something that really, really works, that lets the notes do what they want to do, and then we as musicians and humans can get in there later and kind of mess it up. So those are our two main goals: independence of the various lines and smooth and singable music for the voices to do. So you can sort of imagine that our problems that we're going to run into are where the independence of a line is limited, right? Where something isn't actually working on its own musical purposes and goals. It's sort of tied to something else. Or lines that are too jumpy, which are inherently not smooth and singable, right? Jumpiness is much more difficult to do, right? It's really easy for me to sing this than if the harmony part was, okay, here we go. You got 5 seconds to learn this. Right? That's hard to sing. Sounds great, though, clearly. So what we're going to find is that a common culprit for both of these things is parallel motion. So that's something that we really need to watch out for. It's unfortunate because parallel motion is in many ways the most intuitive type of motion, the most intuitive way to harmonize a line, but it also can create a little bit of a problem because it keeps the lines really tied to one another. So when they're moving together in this way, we just have to be careful and treat them with a little bit more focus because, yes, it works really well, it's really intuitive, but it can really contribute to some funkiness. So we're going to look at some really, really, really specific problems that have fancy names and all that kind of stuff now. But these two goals are the real issue here, that they are being affected. So when we look at all of this stuff, keep your focus on how is this problem or how is this error contributing to the independence of a line being limited or a musical line that is not super smooth and singable. Those are the actual issues. What we're looking at here, we have names for the different ways that those happen, but those are the real serious things that we're trying to keep track of, right? Independence of a line and music that is smooth and singable. So let's look at our first example here. These are the shame, or the sort of, not the shame, but like these are the poster child for part writing errors, parallel fifths and octaves. So let's jump in here. So when we talk about fifths and octaves, you know, all the way back to when we were doing intervals, these are by far the most stable intervals that we have, fifths and octaves. And so that sort of connects to this large idea that the stability that's inherent in a fifth means that it doesn't really want to go anywhere, right? A fifth is so stable, right? It's really, really anchoring the sound in place. And that means it's less effective for moving around. So let's sort of jump in here. We've got a little texture here in B minor. Right? Now, when we're on the keyboard, these things don't always come out super clearly, so we have to sort of sing along to make sure we're really hearing this. But in this first example here, let's look at what's going on, because we actually, in our little 1-5-1 progressions here, we have what's called parallel fifths in this first example between the bass voice and the tenor voice. So let's sort of investigate that, because again, I said a couple minutes ago that parallel motion was the most intuitive. And so if we look at not these lower voices here, but if we look at the soprano and the alto voices, we have parallel motion here as well, because look, this top voice is moving by step, and the bottom voice is also moving by step. So if we listen to that, that's super smooth, right? That sounds really intuitive, really musical. And so if I sang the bottom one, it would sound like this, right? To hear it on two different things. Da, da, da. Super smooth, super intuitive. But the thing is, what interval is that? D up to B is a sixth. And a sixth is much less stable than a fifth, right? Here the sixth is that warm, open sound. It wants to move, whereas fifths don't really want to move. So if we look now at the bottom two parts here, we're in fifths. See how that parallel motion is a lot less smooth than that? And again, if I sing the bottom part, can you hear how it's less smooth than when it's sixths, right? The interval of a sixth is good for moving, but the fifth, see how the fifths have a really different sound to them because they don't want to move. And so if we think about our two big goals here, independence of a line and too jumpy, essentially, music that's too jumpy, this really checks both those boxes. The jumpiness, the bass is jumping, that's fine, basses jump, but the tenors are also jumping, right? Tenors also jumping. That doesn't really make nearly as much sense as the smoothness of those upper two parts. And similarly, the tenor part here doesn't really exist on its own, right? It's just doing what the basses are doing. right? So it has a lack of independence. Let's look at the second example where this lack of independence is even more clear, because in this one, we have what's called parallel octaves, all right? So parallel octaves are when the two different voices are literally just doing the same thing as one another. So if we look here, the basses are singing the same bass line, B, F sharp, B. That's great. Sounds good. Sounds like a bass line. But now let's look at the sopranos, who are here saying, well, I've got the melody, so I'm special. This is my melody. Oh. So the melody and the bass line are the same thing. And that's where you really can get a feel for how this independence being limited thing comes into play. Because when you hear that, octaves make it sound like there isn't, or there aren't, in fact, two lines, but it's just the same single line being sort of doubled at the octave, right? If we take anything and put it at an octave, no matter how far apart it gets, it doesn't sound like it's two separate things. It's the same thing, right? That would be very different if it was, that sounds like there's two different parts, right? But if I say, hey guys, check out this melody I wrote, now check out this awesome bass line I wrote to go with it. That's the same line, right? So we're not going to feel that as two separate things. Instead, if we look at this sort of result, a little fix here, this eliminates the parallel fifths and the parallel octaves, and you can hear the whole thing is smooth and balanced. Yes, the basses jump, but everybody else has a nice line that's really singable, right? No one else is jumping. No one else is tied to the bass line in a super strong way, right? So that's what we mean here by having smooth and singable lines that are independent, that are not just tied to what another voice is doing. That's parallel fifths and octaves. Okay, we're going to kind of speed through these other ones because they're not nearly as important, and you sort of can get you get the big idea from just looking deeply at parallel fifths and octaves. These are contrary fifths and octaves, so this should be really, really quick here. So on this first one, this first example, we have between the basses and the tenors, right? Oh, sorry. Parallel fifths, right? Between the basses and the tenors, parallel fifths. Excuse me. So that's a problem, but the point that's being made here is that we can't fix parallel fifths by just saying, oh, well, if the problem is that they're moving the same direction, I'll have the basses move upwards because it still sounds kind of funky. It doesn't really sound better. See how it still has that strong, tied together sound, not an independent sound? Like, look at the upper two voices. They're independent. The altos are moving down by a third, and the sopranos are moving upwards. Right? Those two lines have their own musical goals and purposes. Whereas, even when they're moving opposite directions, those don't. They're too tied together. So that's contrary fifths and octaves, all right? Same basic idea as parallel fifths. Unequal fifths, again, you can pause the video and really look at this in depth. These are not super critical. These just have to deal with the fact that the issue with parallel fifths and octaves is that they're perfect intervals. Right? That's sort of what makes this sound a little stuck. And again, I'm not saying it sounds bad. Actually, I think it sounds kind of cool, like, right? There's a lot of life in there, but it does sound like it stands out, and it doesn't really want to move as naturally as that, right? So these say that instead, if there's a diminished fifth in there, it doesn't have nearly that same sense of stuckness because diminished fifths are cool to move around. So I'm going to skip through this. Like I said, you can certainly stop here and investigate what's going on. But the main point is that diminished fifths kind of make us not really worry too much about that. Now let's talk about direct fifths and octaves. This is a really interesting one because it highlights how clearly everything is that everything is that happens between the basses and the sopranos, what we call the outer voices. They're the ones that we hear the most prominently. It's usually soprano is kind of code for melody, and bass is the bass line, right? So those are two of the most prominent aspects of a piece of music. So it would make sense for things that happen between those voices to be just a little bit more noticeable. And direct fifths and octaves really tie into that. We know that, or we've seen pretty clearly, I think so far, that fifths and octaves are just a little bit too stable to kind of just meld in and mesh in, and we have to be really careful with those intervals. This also connects to that issue of having music that's too jumpy. And when music is too jumpy, we know that it's not going to be nearly as smooth and singable. So this is saying we really don't, in the outer voices, want to jump, look at the first one, into a fifth. See how the E and the C in the bass and soprano voices here on the first one sound so balanced, it's got warmth to it. And when it hits that fifth, it just kind of is a little too boxy, right? See how it's sort of, we've got this nice, interesting balance, very colorful. Kind of just goes away. Same thing in the next one. Look at the next one. This first chord is so balanced in the soprano and the bass. So warm. And then they're both going to jump to an octave, right? They're both jumping from this nice, open, colorful sound to an octave. And it just means that everything, again, in four voices on the keyboard, you don't hear it as clearly, but when you isolate, it kind of sounds like some of the color, some of the texture drops out a little bit. But let's sort of get a feel, though, from these last two at something really important. Remember, this is about how are we experiencing this? And the point is, if it's in the outer voices, we hear it more clearly. If it's in an inner voice, we don't notice it, right? So if we took the alto voice and the bass voice here in number 3 here, yeah, we would, if we just isolated those, we would hear it. But with the sopranos added in, we don't hear that really at all. It doesn't bother us. And in this last one, if the sopranos aren't jumping, we really don't hear it so much. So the big thing that I want you to take away from this is mostly that we have to be careful with fifths and octaves, and especially the idea of the parallel fifths and the parallel octaves, limiting the independence of the lines and also creating musical lines that are just too jumpy. All right? So that's a lot, but these are really important sort of detail things that we want to look at, because the relationship between all these voices is really important for making sure that we have musical independence and smooth and singable lines.